This podcast comes to you from the University of Toronto, Mississauga. We wish to acknowledge the land on which the university operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. We are grateful to work on this land, and we strive toward peace and reconciliation among all peoples. Hi, I'm Jill Caskey, Associate Professor of Art History at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. Welcome to Medieval Art Matters, a podcast where we showcase the vitality of contemporary research on the Middle Ages. In each episode, we invite a scholar to talk about a critical issue that shaped the experiences of people living centuries ago and that still matters today. I'm joined today by my co-host, Linda Safran.
Hello, I'm Linda Safran, currently at the Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies in Toronto. Our guest is Professor Renata Holod, Professor Emerita in the History of Art Department and Curator of the Near East section at the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania. She has conducted fieldwork across North Africa and Asia, including in Syria, Iran, Egypt, Morocco, Uzbekistan, and Ukraine. She has written or co-authored such books as The Mosque in the Modern World, The City in the Islamic World, and An Island Through Time, Jerba Studies. She has also received many honors and awards for teaching and mentoring students. I should add that Professor Holod's interests and long list of accomplishments began right here at the University of Toronto, where she received an honors Bachelor of Arts degree.
Professor Holod has recently turned her attention to the Great Mosque at Córdoba in Spain, one of the best-known works of Islamic architecture and the subject of countless studies over the last century.
It sounds like this digital humanities project will really help us better understand the experiences of medieval people as they move through the mosque. It also illuminates why the architecture looks the way it does. Welcome, Professor Holod, and thank you so much for being on our show.
Thank you.
We're looking at the interior of the Great Mosque at Córdoba on artofthemiddleages.com. What are some of the architectural features of the mosque that make more sense now that we have a better understanding of its lighting conditions?
What's interesting about Córdoba, but the location was considered to be some sort of sacred location, no matter who controlled it. And what interested me about it was that it had a very peculiar and particular constructional history, because why would you have very short columns and then a double arcade, and then why would this arcade necessarily be of two colors? So white stone and then brick in between. So you mean they didn't have enough stone? No, there's some reason for it. And this is where I started to work with people who were actually psychologists here at University of Pennsylvania, and also people who studied what is the nature of human vision. At what point do you no longer see differentiation in color, but you see light and dark? When it gets darker and darker and darker, you can see the difference between light and dark much longer than you can distinguish the varieties of color. At Penn, we have this way of putting together faculty from different departments and even different schools. You're not only in your own little, soup. You can really do cross-disciplinary investigations in a much more interesting fashion. I love working collaboratively. In any case, we also set up a new major at University of Pennsylvania, which was called Visual Studies. So it had psychologists, it had philosophers, it had people who were, in different departments. And so we started to sort of investigate, well, how is it that you see actually? So imagine being in Córdoba, being in the mosque, and all of a sudden you have all of these arches that go back and forth all the time. And so that's what was interesting to me in the last version of the mosque, is that the arches in front of the mihrab are all crossing each other. And then as you turn around, it's alive. I mean, all of these are constantly crossing as you're moving around the building. That was amazing. And so now, on top of this was, in fact, yet another issue. And this is, how do you see when the light is dim, so that you have the light and the dark in the arches? So all of a sudden, you not only do you have the arches crossing each other, but because they're two colors, which you see as light and dark, they're crossing each other all the time. And that is why in the last version, you have the crossing arches in front of the mihrab that are, really quite different, because they are a summary of what it is that you have experienced as you walk into the entire place.
Okay, so that means the color contrasts in the arches would really pop out, whether the lighting inside was bright or not. And you're describing that concentration of different kinds of intersecting arches around the mihrab that would intensify the dynamism at the holiest part of the mosque, whether it's dawn or midday or late at night. That's a key idea, then, that the architectural design is attentive to how people see, not just what they see. So, Professor Holod, are there scientific ideas that relate to this that were floating around in the Islamic world or in the city of Córdoba itself at this time?
I started looking at the history of science and the history of seeing. And of course, there was Ibn al-Haytham, known in medieval Western literature as Al-Hazan. And so you have kind of an investigation of how it is that humans see already going on at the Cordoban court. Now, what's interesting about the Cordoban court is that the heir apparent waited a long time to become caliph, and was then a patron of all sorts of people, including this scientist. Around the year 1000 came the sort of the fuller expansion of this. But Ibn al-Haytham was actually already in a line of scientists and philosophers who had been already exploring the nature of seeing. A particular person called Al-Kindi, who was in line with the Neoplatonists. And so, you have this continuum of exploration of the nature of human seeing, understanding, and remembering, and how it is that you navigate through space.
Professor Holod, it's remarkable the interdisciplinary and collaborative nature of the work that you've done with scientists, with philosophers, working on the history of science and the history of philosophy too. And it seems like you've worked a lot with technology to push these questions about seeing and sight in the Great Mosque. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about technology and what kinds of questions technology has really allowed you to work with, probe, or answer.
Right now, if you go as a tourist to visit the Mosque of Córdoba, they put on these huge reflector lights, and this is not how it was experienced. So I actually came in really early in the morning just to see how it is that, this interior comes alive as the sun rises. And so where is the sun at different locations? And then why you have all of these different views. Where are the lanterns located? One other thing that I noticed was that there are a lot of people who left pious foundations for the lighting of the mosque. And the point is that you're not going to light the entire place every single time. You only do it on specific occasions when you're sure that the place will be full. Part of what was interesting to me, and I had worked on other kinds of pious foundations before, and I also always noticed that so much money was put in trust to light the interior of X or Y. I mean, I said, well, why? I went to Cairo in Tunisia, and I noticed that in the main aisle, you have these hanging lanterns, and there are trays. Who was lighting them, and how, and they didn't light the whole thing all at once. For some occasions, it was like regular days, one tray was enough. But then you really put on the show for major occasions. The experience of an interior is key when it's, the way, depending on the way it's lit. I got my engineering colleagues, so we came to, some kind of solution saying, okay, so not only where the sun was at different times of year and different times of day, but also how do you actually see this interior when you only light, the main aisle, or when you only light the place in front of the mihrab.
How do we know that lighting was important in medieval Córdoba and elsewhere in the Islamicate world, for that matter?
Well, insofar as there are pious foundations, so clearly the idea that a mosque is supported by contributions is a key issue. There is also the attributes of God. So you have a term nur, the light. So you have this idea that God is light. And of course, there are these titles, Nurullah, the light of God. These are the kinds of terms that you will see both as titles, but also as attributes of God. So lighting an interior was actually part and parcel of how it is that you experience a lit place.
Where do you see the field of Islamic art and architectural history going? And where would you like it to go?
Oh boy. Okay. I'm not sure it's one field any longer. I think it's at least two fields. And you can divide it geographically or chronologically. Consider this. If you're studying material that is 10th century material, that's one thing. But the 10th century in the subcontinent is very different than the 10th century in North Africa. And the field has grown enormously. My own students are, all over in terms of both time and location. And also you need different languages. So I was lucky enough to begin with Islamic studies at the University of Toronto and slog through Arabic and Turkish. And then finally Persian was such a godsend when I got to Harvard. It was like, oh, that's easy. And also think of it this way. For the early stuff, you actually also have to get into archaeology. For the later stuff, well, you should be able to be almost a poet. So, Persian poetry is extremely complex. The metaphors that are used in Persian poetry, let's say 17th century Persian poetry, are yet a whole different world. It's very important if you're actually looking at the question of aesthetics to really understand how this functions vis-a-vis the visual.
Thank you so much, Professor Holod, for coming to speak with us today.
Bye-bye.
That was Professor Renata Holod of the University of Pennsylvania, speaking to us about the Great Mosque of Córdoba and especially about its lighting.
You've been listening to an episode of Medieval Art Matters, hosted by Linda Safran and me, Jill Caskey. Medieval Art Matters complements the book written by Jill Caskey, Adam Cohen, and Linda Safran, called Art and Architecture of the Middle Ages, Exploring a Connected World. It is published by Cornell University Press. For more information, go to the website that accompanies the book, artofthemiddleages.com, where you'll also find more podcasts in this series.
Medieval Art Matters is made possible by the support of the Department of Art History at the University of Toronto, St. George Campus, and the Office of the Vice Principal and Dean, University of Toronto, Mississauga. Many thanks to the Toronto Consort for providing the music.
This podcast was brought to you by Cited Media Productions. Thanks for listening.
You have been listening to a Cited Media production. CIDED. Find out more at citedmedia.ca.